The morning of Robert's funeral, the rain had no mercy. It pounded the streets, slicked the sidewalks, and slammed against my car windows as if the sky itself knew the weight of the grief I was about to face. I drove in silence, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, trying to convince myself that I could carry this day with dignity. 40 years. 40 years of marriage, quiet nights, whispered conversations, shared obligations, and the silent, uncelebrated labor of keeping a life intact. I had believed we had built something unshakable, a home, a family, a rhythm that no storm could break. And now, in a matter of minutes, it would all be stripped away, not by the hands of fate alone, but by the carefully hidden choices of a man I had loved. The chapel was crowded, the murmur of voices rising and falling like the tide. Guests I barely recognized nodded politely, whispered condolences, and offered awkward smiles. My charcoal gray wool coat clung to me as I walked through the entrance, and I wondered if any of them could feel the tremor beneath my composure. I smiled, because that is what Robert had always expected. A perfect facade, no cracks, no vulnerabilities. Then Daniel appeared. Our son, my only child. 33, tall, commanding, yet at this moment, vulnerable. He took the podium with a calm that belied the tremor in his voice, and I felt a flicker of pride. I believed, for one brief heartbeat, that perhaps he would finally acknowledge the invisible scaffolding of our family, the sacrifices, the quiet nights, the unspoken support I had provided all these years. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. My father's life was shaped by someone who understood him, Daniel said, his voice steady but trembling at the edges. Someone who truly was family to us. I leaned forward slightly, heart beating frantically. The word mother hovered on the edge of his tongue, a fleeting promise I had been waiting for 40 years to hear. And then, like a blade slicing through hope, he said, Miss Linda Mallister. The room seemed to shatter. Eyes turned toward her in the front row. Emerald green coat, perfectly coiffed hair, flawless makeup, delicate tears glistening. She smiled, triumphant yet serene, and in that instant, the world around me became a blur. I was invisible. My role as Robert's wife, Daniel's mother, the one who had poured her life into our family, erased in a single sentence. The morning of Robert's funeral, the rain had no mercy. It pounded the streets, slicked the sidewalks, and slammed against my car windows as if the sky itself knew the weight of the grief I was about to face. I drove in silence, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, trying to convince myself that I could carry this day with dignity. 40 years. 40 years of marriage, quiet nights, whispered conversations, shared obligations, and the silent, uncelebrated labor of keeping a life intact. I had believed we had built something unshakable, a home, a family, a rhythm that no storm could break. And now, in a matter of minutes, it would all be stripped away, not by the hands of fate alone, but by the carefully hidden choices of a man I had loved. The chapel was crowded, the murmur of voices rising and falling like the tide. Guests I barely recognized nodded politely, whispered condolences, and offered awkward smiles. My charcoal gray wool coat clung to me as I walked through the entrance, and I wondered if any of them could feel the tremor beneath my composure. I smiled, because that is what Robert had always expected. A perfect facade, no cracks, no vulnerabilities. Then Daniel appeared. Our son, my only child. 33, tall, commanding, yet at this moment, vulnerable. He took the podium with a calm that belied the tremor in his voice, and I felt a flicker of pride. I believed, for one brief heartbeat, that perhaps he would finally acknowledge the invisible scaffolding of our family, the sacrifices, the quiet nights, the unspoken support I had provided all these years. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. My father's life was shaped by someone who understood him, Daniel said, his voice steady but trembling at the edges. Someone who truly was family to us. I leaned forward slightly, heart beating frantically. The word mother hovered on the edge of his tongue, a fleeting promise I had been waiting for 40 years to hear. And then, like a blade slicing through hope, he said, Miss Linda Mallister. The room seemed to shatter. Eyes turned toward her in the front row. Emerald green coat, perfectly coiffed hair, flawless makeup, delicate tears glistening. She smiled, triumphant yet serene, and in that instant, the world around me became a blur. I was invisible. My role as Robert's wife, Daniel's mother, the one who had poured her life into our family, erased in a single sentence. Among the documents, a folder of letters from property management companies caught my attention. Dates spanning 6 years. The recipient, Linda Mallister. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. A property I had visited, never realizing it was for her. All those years, thinking I was simply missing out on a company project, when in reality, she was being groomed to take my place. I needed someone to help me untangle the web. Ruth Lanier, a former colleague who had remained a trusted friend, was my only option. I called her immediately, explaining everything I had discovered. Her response was cautious but firm. Maggie, if what you suspect is true, this is bigger than a marital betrayal. This is systematic fraud. Her words did not frighten me. They galvanized me. For the first time in decades, the fire within me sparked. I realized I had been living on someone else's rhythm, dancing to Robert's carefully orchestrated life, ignoring my own desires, my own agency. I spent the following days piecing together evidence: bank statements, photo albums, emails, property records. Every detail reinforced the same story. Robert had methodically diverted wealth, attention, and legacy to Linda Mallister, and the one person he had promised to protect, the woman who had built the foundation for his life and success, me, was left in the shadows. As the rain continued to lash against the windows, I pored over the photos, letters, and documents. There was no ambiguity anymore. No plausible deniability. The truth had revealed itself in its full, brutal clarity. The following morning, I awoke with a clarity I had never known in 40 years of marriage. The grief still lingered, but it was overlaid with a sharp, burning purpose. This was no longer about mourning Robert. It was about uncovering the hidden life he had built without me and reclaiming what had been stolen. Ruth Lanier became my first ally. We met at her small, pale gray bungalow, its front garden lined with chrysanthemums that had seen better days. She greeted me warmly and gestured toward her kitchen table, already cluttered with stacks of papers, and her laptop open to various records. "I've pulled archived company records," she said, her voice steady, her glasses perched firmly on her nose. "There are transactions labeled as consulting support, but the beneficiary company has no physical office, no employees, nothing. It's a shell." My stomach twisted as I realized the extent of the deceit. "How much?" I asked, barely able to breathe. Ruth scrolled through the entries. 3 payments totaling $350,000, staggered over the past 5 years, each timed outside official audit cycles. No invoices of equivalent value exist. The numbers felt surreal. Decades of my life, the sacrifices, the loyalty, the sleepless nights raising Daniel, contrasted violently against these secret transfers. Every dollar, every cent of my labor had helped him, and in return, he had been quietly building an empire for someone else. I asked Ruth to help me organize everything: statements, photographs, property records, and even screenshots of Linda's social media accounts, where Robert and Daniel appeared in intimate, casual, happy moments, all evidence of a hidden reality I had never been allowed to see. The next step was a legal consultation. Michelle Robinson, a seasoned corporate and fraud attorney, agreed to meet me downtown. Her office overlooked the Chicago skyline, sunlight reflecting off the glass skyscrapers, sharp and cold as the clarity I now possessed. "I need to see everything," she said calmly, accepting the neatly organized folder of evidence I carried. Emails, documents, photos, statements, Every detail you have. If this is intentional diversion of company funds, we can build a case. Sitting across from her, I realized something profound. I was no longer the silent, invisible wife, the one who had quietly facilitated everything for Robert and Daniel. I was Maggie Smith, a woman with knowledge, power, and proof. The truth was mine to wield. Over the following weeks, my life became a whirlwind. Ruth assisted in cataloging every document, verifying dates, cross-referencing property purchases with company expense reports. We discovered properties bought under Linda's name during projects I had once overseen, houses I had visited, unaware they were never meant for family, but for her. The details compounded, layer upon layer, small anomalies in expense reports, meetings Robert had held without my knowledge, emails from corporate addresses forwarded to Linda's personal account. Each discovery reinforced the pattern: deliberate, long-term, and deeply personal betrayal. Meanwhile, Daniel's attitude was shifting. Or perhaps, I realized, he had always seen the world through Robert's eyes. He sided with Linda, defending her as if she were the family he believed she had always been. Every conversation with him was a delicate dance, a negotiation of memory and perception. "You're destroying his memory," he said on the phone, his voice tight, edged with anger. He cared about her. He made her part of his life. "Why are you challenging it?" I breathed slowly, holding my resolve. "Daniel, his memory isn't destroyed. The truth is finally being revealed. You need to see the life he built in the shadows, without us. That's the real betrayal." The legal filings followed. Michelle helped prepare a lawsuit for fraud and diversion of funds. We submitted evidence, including the property records, payment trails, and photographic proof of Robert's secret arrangements. Each document told a story of meticulous planning, of manipulation, and of long-term betrayal. Linda and her attorney tried to deflect, claiming the payments were legitimate consulting fees. They produced invoices, but Ruth had already cross-referenced them with internal company logs. No service had been rendered. The evidence was overwhelming, the story undeniable. Throughout this period, I faced an internal battle as well. Every step toward justice was punctuated by memories of Daniel's childhood. Nights spent by his bedside during asthma attacks, defending him from bullies, comforting him through heartbreaks. Everything I had done to protect and nurture him now seemed to clash with the adult he had become, someone who had, at least temporarily, aligned himself with the narrative Robert had built for Linda. And yet, there was no turning back. Every proof, every document, every photo was a stitch in a tapestry of truth I could no longer ignore. One evening, after hours of reviewing accounts and photos, I sat at the kitchen table, exhausted but resolute. The rain tapped against the window, a familiar rhythm that now felt less oppressive and more like a drumbeat heralding change. I looked at the folder of evidence spread before me and realized the journey ahead would be long, arduous, and emotionally brutal. But it was necessary. The first court date was set. Linda, confident and composed in public, would soon face scrutiny she had carefully avoided for years. And Daniel, my son, would witness the full reality of the life his father had orchestrated without us. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of anticipation and resolve settling into my bones. For 40 years, I had lived in the shadows of Robert's carefully curated world. Now, I would step into the light, not just for myself, but for the truth, for my dignity, and for the family I had built in silence. The morning of the court date dawned gray and somber, rain still dripping from the eaves, reflecting the mood that had been my constant companion for weeks. I dressed deliberately, choosing a navy blue suit that conveyed calm authority. No morning black today. Today, I was preparing to stand for myself. The courtroom was tense, filled with spectators, lawyers, and journalists who had caught wind of the high-profile case. Cameras lingered on Linda Mallister as she entered, flawless, composed, seemingly unaffected by the gravity of the proceedings. Her presence was a carefully maintained illusion, just as it had always been. Michelle Robinson guided me through the details one last time. Remember, Maggie, this isn't just about emotion. We have evidence, facts, dates, transactions, photographs. They cannot be ignored. Speak clearly, firmly, and keep your composure. Your story, your truth, is your strongest weapon. I nodded, heart pounding, yet a strange calm settled over me. 40 years of patience, sacrifice, and loyalty had culminated in this moment. I was no longer invisible. The trial began with a formal reading of Robert's will. The courtroom held its collective breath as the judge, a distinguished African-American woman in her mid-60s, outlined the assets, the beneficiaries, and the peculiar, highly suspicious financial transfers. Linda's attorney attempted to frame the payments as legitimate consulting fees, showing invoices and spreadsheets. But when Michelle cross-examined the records, discrepancies became glaringly obvious. One by one, we revealed evidence Ruth had meticulously compiled. Bank statements showing staggered, unexplained payments, property records tracing acquisitions directly to Linda during periods when I had been incapacitated or otherwise distracted by family obligations. Photographs of Robert and Linda in intimate domestic settings, juxtaposed against images of my own overlooked presence in their lives. Each piece of evidence hit like a hammer strike. I watched Linda's composed mask falter just slightly as the truth was laid bare. I saw it in the tightening of her jaw, the slight flutter in her eyes. The illusion she had maintained for years was beginning to crumble. Then came the moment I had dreaded and anticipated in equal measure. Daniel, my son, my boy, my lifelong companion, had chosen her side for reasons I had only begun to understand.
Now, he was seated in the courtroom, expressions unreadable, yet the tension between us was palpable. He whispered something to Linda, a subtle gesture that seemed to signal loyalty, understanding, or perhaps even defiance. I could feel my chest tighten as I realized that his perception of family had been shaped entirely by Robert and Linda, not by me. But I also knew that exposure of the truth was the only way to reclaim what had been lost. I took the stand. The courtroom went silent. Every eye was on me. Every heartbeat felt like a drum in my ears. I began speaking slowly, deliberately, recounting 40 years of devotion, sacrifice, and love, of nights spent tending to Daniel's needs, of decades of managing Robert's affairs, both personal and professional. And then I told the story no one had ever heard. The secret properties, the staggered payments, the long-hidden life Robert had built for Linda, excluding me. I held nothing back. The words, once trapped behind layers of grief and disbelief, poured forth, each syllable weighted with the gravity of betrayal. Linda's expression changed in real time. The mask was gone. Her eyes widened as she realized that the meticulous secrets she had relied upon for years were now evidence against her. She whispered to her attorney, desperation creeping into her posture. But the facts were undeniable. The judge, composed and impartial, absorbed every detail, nodding occasionally, marking notes meticulously. Then the most painful confrontation of all, Daniel. I looked directly at him, the boy I had raised, the young man who had once clung to me in fear and joy. I saw his hesitation, the flicker of uncertainty that had never been there when he defended Linda blindly. "Maggie," he said quietly, his voice trembling, "you've always brought up the past as if it's a debt owed. But Dad, he loved her. He respected her choices. You were too strong, too controlling." I drew in a slow, steadying breath. "Daniel," I said, calm but firm, "I gave you everything. My time, my energy, my love. I raised you through hardships, defended you from the world, and nurtured the very man your father became. And yet, you believed this illusion that loyalty to him required erasing me." He looked away. Silence filled the courtroom, heavy and suffocating. And then, slowly, recognition dawned in his eyes. He saw, finally, the depth of my sacrifices, the hidden labor that had made all their lives possible. The truth, once obscured by fear, love, and misperception, was now unavoidable. By the end of the trial, the judgment was clear. The judge ruled in our favor. Linda was ordered to repay every dollar, including interest, and relinquish the properties acquired through the fraudulent transfers. She left the courtroom broke, her reputation irreparably damaged. And Daniel? He took years to fully reconcile. The first conversation after the trial was tentative, awkward, but real. He began to understand slowly the magnitude of what had been done and the depth of my dedication. Over time, our relationship began to heal, not immediately, but with a patient, careful rebuilding. That night, I walked into the garden. The crabapple tree I had planted decades ago stood resilient, blooming earlier than ever despite the trials it had weathered. I touched the bark, feeling the rough texture beneath my fingers, and realized the truth about resilience, about strength. I had been pushed, tested, and betrayed, but I had survived. I returned inside, hung up the clothes, closed the windows against the rain, and for the first time in decades, felt a sense of self that was entirely mine. I was no longer a supporting character in someone else's story. I was Maggie Smith, a survivor, a fighter, and a woman whose life, her own life, had finally been reclaimed. The days after the court ruling felt surreal. The rain had finally stopped, replaced by sharp autumn sunlight that cut through the blinds of my living room like a spotlight on a stage I had never imagined stepping onto. For the first time in decades, I walked through my home with awareness of every object, every memory, and every hidden possibility. I decided to take control, to rebuild the life that Robert and his schemes had attempted to overshadow. First, I returned to the profession I had abandoned, financial consulting. My credentials were still intact, and the tech and corporate world I had once navigated with precision now seemed like a playground ready to be explored anew. Ruth remained my closest ally. "Maggie," she said one morning as we reviewed client leads and property portfolios, "you've already proven you can handle betrayal and deceit. Think of this as a new challenge, a way to reclaim not just your finances but your independence." Her words resonated deeply. Independence, freedom, self-determination, concepts I had long relegated to the background while dedicating myself to family and household duties. I realized that these past 40 years, while filled with love and devotion, had also taught me the tools necessary to navigate life without fear or compromise. Meanwhile, Linda Mallister's downfall continued to ripple through professional circles. News outlets reported on the court ruling and the recovered assets. Corporate blogs dissected the case with fascination. How a seemingly minor assistant had manipulated a powerful man for years, and how the legal wife had uncovered everything. Some days I caught myself scanning her social media, not out of obsession but to understand the trajectory of someone who had taken so much from me. Her posts, once curated carefully to project perfection, now revealed cracks. Frustration, anxiety, and occasional attempts at public redemption became visible in her words. One afternoon, Michelle called. "Maggie, I've been reviewing additional financial trails. There are still minor discrepancies in offshore holdings that may have been part of Robert's secret networks. If you want, we can pursue them next. This could ensure that all illicit gains are accounted for." I paused, considering the temptation. Justice was not only personal, it had become a principle. But I knew I had to balance this pursuit with rebuilding my own life, not being consumed by vengeance alone. Daniel remained distant. Every attempt at conversation seemed to falter. He visited occasionally, each meeting carefully orchestrated and polite, but the warmth that had defined our mother-son bond was fragile. I understood him. He had grown up idolizing his father, internalizing Robert's narrative and long-term deception. The truth was difficult for him to accept. Yet I noticed subtle changes. Small signs of hesitation when he defended Linda, a flicker of doubt when he saw the evidence, or when he caught glimpses of Ruth's meticulous organization. Seeds of recognition were planted. To reclaim not only my financial independence but also my emotional balance, I began engaging in activities long neglected. I returned to painting, a hobby I had abandoned when raising Daniel. My brushstrokes became both therapy and rebellion, a way to externalize years of suppressed feelings. Simultaneously, I joined a local book club focused on corporate women who had returned to work after long absences. The stories were varied, each woman a mirror reflecting possibilities I had long forgotten. Together, we discussed reinvention, negotiation tactics, and self-respect, fueling my resolve to fully reclaim my autonomy. Meanwhile, I pursued the remaining traces of Robert's deception. Ruth had compiled a list of smaller transactions, shell accounts, and offshore properties connected to Linda and Robert's corporate dealings. Each discovery was both exhilarating and exhausting. One evening, as the sun set behind the skyline, I leaned over the kitchen table reviewing another batch of PDFs, bank statements, and email correspondence. There, between lines of mundane company correspondence, were coded notes, references to wire transfers, and scheduled property purchases. My pulse quickened. The evidence was undeniable. Linda had continued to manipulate, not out of necessity, but out of long-term strategic planning. This part of the journey required not just legal acumen but psychological insight. I realized that Linda's manipulation had worked for decades because she understood Robert's weaknesses: his need for admiration, fear of confrontation, and susceptibility to flattery. I had known him intimately, yet her subtle influence had escaped me entirely. Daniel's involvement became increasingly complex. He oscillated between defending Linda and silently questioning the story he had always accepted. One evening, as we sat across from each other with coffee in hand, he finally admitted, hesitantly, "Mom, I see the transactions you've uncovered. I didn't understand before. But seeing it now, it's hard." I reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand over his. "Daniel, understanding doesn't erase the past, but it allows you to see truth clearly. That is how we move forward." The sincerity in his eyes marked a turning point. Recognition, acknowledgement, and acceptance. All the seeds planted months ago were beginning to grow. I also began documenting everything for myself, not as evidence for another court case, but as personal affirmation. Each journal entry, photo compilation, and chronological record became a narrative of survival and awakening. I realized that reclaiming my life was as much about internal restoration as it was about external justice. The story of betrayal had been written by Robert and Linda, but the story of recovery, resilience, and reclamation would be mine.